Greetings and welcome to my lecture for the Design for Spatial Justice course. My name is Pilam Simang and I am presently a lecturer of philosophy at Stellenbosch University. Today, my talk is called Race and Social Life, and I feel that it's a prerequisite to understanding social justice debates in South Africa, specifically spatial justice debates. Because as we'll discuss, you'll see that race is a matter that touches almost every aspect of public life in this country. As I just said, race and racism in South Africa is something that permeates all aspects of lived reality here. It's one of the primary antagonisms, I feel, in South African society. You can't understand the South African situation without an understanding of its racial order and the origins of this racial order and how this racial order continues to affect people in their day-to-day. It's the general aspects of their lives that are deeply correlated with race and socioeconomic class. At this point, one might think, why don't we just speak about class alone or socioeconomic status alone? But socioeconomic status in this country is also significantly correlated for race. And this is not an accidental thing. This is not just a coincidence. It's for political and socio-historical reasons that by design have shaped our society to be this way. And there's a number of, big history events that we can think of, or big history processes, not events, but processes that we can think of. That have made this be the situation that it is. And you can think of colonialism and slavery in this country, apartheid, more recently, even without those more explicit policies towards people, there's still systematic exclusion and a government failing at redress. For whatever reason it might be that the government is failing at redress, be it a lack of will or whatever the case may be. And so there are many reasons why race still remains a central issue in the country that permeates these different aspects of lived experience, of life chances. And these are some that we're going to go through in this talk, specifically with an eye to getting to questions of space. How does this fit in then with how we spatially organize our lives? In general, race was considered to be some kind of scientific problem. The idea of race being one that's a scientific hypothesis, and then the problem of racism also then being one that is a scientific problem. So for the longest of times, the strategy was that people who are knowledgeable about the subject, scientists, anthropologists, their job was to debunk scientific racism. Scientific racism is a pseudoscientific theory. At some point in time, it was put forward as a hypothesis about human differences. Let's go back to Victorian times. People come up with these hypotheses that people are different from one another in these specific types of ways, that there are inherent biological characteristics in individuals that are typical of the group which they belong to, and those traits are ostensibly exclusive to the racial groups which they belong. Modern science comes, science after the Victorian age comes, and finds out that almost all the claims made about races are false. So the presupposition here is that modern racism was based on false scientific theories. So if the public can be educated about the falsity of these theories, then we can end racism. Racism will end. And the result of this in the 20th century was that institutions and international bodies focused on educational drives to debunk scientific racism. And a great example of this, and one that produced a number of different types of media and literature, is UNESCO, the cultural arm of the UN. And UNESCO statements on race are an important chapter in this strategy of trying to effect change and intervene in the problem of racism. But is racism truly a scientific problem? Is it something that the level of intervention that needs to happen, is it one that can be achieved solely through, say, re-education programs, solely through showing people what contemporary science actually proves about different human beings? Or could the problem of race be one of power relations, social relations between people that make it irrelevant whether or not there is any truth in the scientific knowledge that we have about different groups of people, whether or not races are real and races don't exist? Is it the case that there can be something within our social relations, in the way in which our society is structured, that would make that scientific truth irrelevant to actual lived reality? Well, we've run a case study of this in real life. We've run a case study of this in the actual world. Given that the educational drive that we saw in the 20th century, the educational drives against racism, have not been accompanied with the end of racism. Racism did not end just because we knew that the theories of race, which a lot of racism draws on, a lot of racism is an analog to, are false. The theories about the inherent biological differences between groups, for example. And I think then it's important then for us to point out that these drives that were in the 20th century were not really accompanied with material repair of the damage and crimes of racism. And the damage and crimes of racism are the effects of discrimination. These are the things that happen to people that deprive them of full participation in their societies, or had them as second-class citizens, had them as slaves, or exploited as menial laborers and excluded from the benefits of modern society, of contemporary society, and purposefully suppressed and oppressed. These groups failed at moving up the social ladder by design. Social mobility was restricted to certain groups of people and not others. And historically speaking, when thinking about the crimes of racism, it hasn't been the case that there's been material repair, with the exception of the German Jewish experience, the German Jewish case. Instead of repair, history actually gives us many examples of efforts to protect the gains of racist dispossession and the gains of racism more generally. And we get examples of this across the globe, especially against indigenous populations in settler colonial societies. This is also the case that I'll be making about South Africa. So let's look at some of the ways in which the gains of racism have been protected. Here's a United States example. The District of Columbia compensated slave owners for the loss of their slaves. This was in the District of Columbia Compensation Act of 1862. This strategy was copied and pasted elsewhere. And it wasn't the first time this had happened in the modern world, where it's the slave owners that were compensated for the loss of slaves, laborers, and not the human beings who were being exploited. The human beings being exploited were not the ones to be compensated. And when we think also about the abolition of slavery, we often think of it in a very black and white sense of there was slavery before, then slavery ended, people were emancipated, and the only real struggles that they had were to rebuild their lives and escape the forms of prejudice that still existed. But with the abolition of slavery, you find that there were many provisions in the law for slave-like relations between former slaves and slave masters. Examples of this is like in Puerto Rico in 1873, they had an apprenticeship system that continued these kinds of relations of dominance and pretty much slave-like relations. In South Africa, this happens as well with the Boer republics in the 19th century after the British abolished slavery, and there's the heavy reliance on farm labor. Although slavery is now illegal, there are other ways in which people are now bonded. Bonded labor was the term that was often used. Bonded labor, not slavery, because slavery was abolished. And another example of this is the indentured servitude that happened across British colonies, but in South Africa, in the Cape, and specifically in Natal. The story of how we have such a large population from the South Asian continent has a lot to do with slavery, and then later on indentured servitude. Indians in Natal. So although legally we can say things like slavery were abolished, legally there were ways in which provisions were made to maintain the gains of racism that were gained through racist discrimination and specifically through slavery. Other ways in which gains of racism have been protected in formal settings. It's like the sunset clauses of the negotiated settlements in South Africa. We also decided not to prosecute the economic crimes of apartheid. We have not dismantled the mechanisms of disadvantage. One huge area in this respect is education. Education, not just in the higher education sector, where we often hear cries from students and protests about making higher education more accessible. One of our deepest problems is that our primary and secondary education sector is in shambles, and it's in shambles for the poor and disadvantaged of this country, who are majority black. And so this just is one of the many things that perpetuates generational disadvantage. Because if you don't go to a good school, you're probably not even going to get to university. But then the way in which our economy is set up, you're likely, all likelihood, your economic participation is not one that's going to allow you to pull yourself out of disadvantage. And so then it becomes cyclical, generation after generation. And so we haven't made many strides or significant strides in dismantling some of those destiny changing mechanisms, or destiny fixing in this case, because people get stuck in the rut in which they're born. So without us changing those mechanisms of disadvantage, a lot of the time a race does a lot one's chances in life, and we'll get into that a bit more a little bit later. And arguably, Section 25 in our Constitution, the Property Clause, it grants property rights even if the land can be shown through historical records to have been stolen, since our law only makes provision for government action after 1913. you are allowed to claim land and have land given back to to original owners of the land, so long as you are able to show that it was a government action after 1913. I'm not certain about what happens in cases where people try to bring to the courts cases of land theft before, and that happened through non-state actors. But so far as I know, we do not have provisions for things outside of government action before 1913. And that brings a question also to the basis of because we could change this if we wanted to, but do we have the political will to change this? And within our understanding of justice, is what's going on just? That there are only provisions for government action after 1913. So there are many political decisions, in fact, that we make that reinscribe and reinforce the gains of racism to specific segments of society. So let's look at the demographics of South Africa before we start looking at a bit of the numbers behind what I mean when I make these kinds of claims. So I think this is from the mid-year estimates, the 2020 mid-year estimates last year about how big our population is. We are not going to be having a census in 2021, despite the fact that the census is scheduled to happen once every decade. Given COVID, this has changed. From Statistics SA has said that they won't be doing a nationwide census in 2021, but rather in 2022. And in 2021, what we'll have is actually a pilot rather than a census. But yeah, so with the estimates, the mid-year estimates in 2020, South Africa is made up of, there's 4 population groups that they split us up to, 4 demographic population groups in respect to race. There's black, there's white, there's colored, and there's Indian. The 5th category is not a racial category that appears in our census, but other. It's other. So it's a miscellaneous group. So anyway, 81% of the country is black. In terms of a term of the census is black African, since they split colored from black. So 81% is black African. Then 9% is colored. 8% is white, and about 3% is Indian. It seems like stats are just 1% off, but really this is an estimate. Remember that these are estimates. So it's around about 81% black, around about 9% colored, about 8% white, and about 3% Indian. What we'll be finding in what's to follow is that although South Africa is a majority black country, it's still dominated by white people. Blacks are overrepresented in areas of disadvantage, whereas whites are overrepresented in areas of advantage. You'll see that in most of these statistics that black African people and colored people, both of those groups are always overrepresented in areas of disadvantage. But in areas of advantage, you would see that white people are always overrepresented, and sometimes Indians too. In fact, in a lot of the cases, what you'll find is that whites outstretch everyone, Indians are catching up, and the colored and black population are not catching up at all, probably doing the same or doing even worse than before. So it's a dire situation, but let's get into that. So with that demographic profile in your mind, of what South Africa looks like on a demographic level, and with the assumption of equity or egalitarianism, there should be a distribution that matches the demographic profile of the country. But that's not the case with about pretty much anything that is of importance in this country. Here I've got a few charts, a few graphs from different sources. The one on the top right, for example, about South Africans living below the poverty line, is from Statistics South Africa. The data is from Statistics South Africa anyway. And what we see there is that black folk, they're almost half of black females are living below the poverty line, and about 45% of black males are living below the poverty line. With the colored population, it's under 30%, between about that looks like about 23%. But then far below that is the white and Indian population, who very few of them live below the poverty line. Now, poverty is terrible and something that we should eradicate in our societies completely. But that still doesn't answer the question of how come this evil is distributed in the way it is in our society. How come? Is it that almost half of the black population lives in squalor or below the poverty line, whereas very few of the white and Indian population live under the poverty line? How have we designed our society to have these kinds of outcomes where there is poverty in the first place, but then that poverty is concentrated in certain demographic groups? And below that bar graph beneath is income levels relative to white levels of income in the country. So the standard here, the baseline is white earnings, and the comparison of earnings between the four demographic groups here and white people is shown over a period of about 100 years. And what we see there is a consistent pattern for black and colored individuals whose earnings are below white people's earnings, but not approaching white people's earnings. White people earn far more than other population groups, and then coloreds earn more than black people, but less than the Asian or Indian population of the country. But blacks and coloreds, the gap between their earnings and white levels of earnings seem to be consistent, and have been consistent for the last 100 years or so. But when we look at the Asian population, the Indian population, we find that their income levels are approaching white income levels. And from about the 90s, there's been a sharp acceleration towards reaching the income levels of whites. The question here we may ask ourselves is why other population groups, the black and colored population groups in particular, are not also having their earnings increase and approach white income levels. On the left-hand side, we have a figure there from the 20th Commission for Employment Equity from their 2019 to 2020 report. And this graph shows senior management by population group and gender from 2017 to 2019. And it shows it actually shows quite clearly. It shows quite clearly how inequitable the workplaces, the work environment is in South Africa. So on the bar graph, you see the very light brown color. That shows the economically active population of that demographic group. So, for example, let's just use the first bar graph as an example. So the economically active population for African males is about 43%. But then when you look at who's in senior management, in 2014, out of the 42.7% of economically active African males, you find that only 14.5% or 15% of them are in senior management roles. But let's look at, say, white females. White females make up 3.8% of the economically active population, but in 2019 they made up 18.1% of senior management. White males, on the other hand, as well, they make up 4.9%. So let's say about 5% of the economically active population. And in 2019, that same population made up 35.7% of senior management, whilst they are only making up 4.9% of the economically active population. So this is also showing this pattern of disproportional representation. And the question that we might ask is, how does this keep happening? What is the reason for these unequitable outcomes? Another way in which the gains of racism are maintained are through our literal spatial arrangements. It speaks more directly to the theme of the course, but actually all of these things go hand in hand, because economic participation also determines where one is able to move, where one is able to live, where one is able to visit, what types of activities one is able to partake in the space that they're in. Even the very same spaces are experienced extremely differently, depending on one's context, one's means, one's social class, and in South Africa, one's race. Because race by itself, as well, because of prejudice and discrimination, and also because race correlates deeply with all of those other factors as well. The situation is so dire that we once made a Time magazine cover as the world's most unequal country. That was the headline for that cover. One thing, though, that is not stressed or described in any detail since the Time article, and usually when people speak about those statistics about South Africa being the most unequal country in the world, the most unequal place on the planet, is that they're speaking about the Gini coefficient of the country as a whole. They speak about the Gini coefficient of South Africa as a national unit. One thing that statistic does not reveal immediately is how inequality has a racial color to it in South Africa. That inequality here is highly color-coded. So with this cover, for example, the neighborhood on the left is a white suburb, whereas the neighborhood on the right would be one where black people would live. Informal settlements are predominantly spaces where black people would be found, and not white people. And the question then becomes, why is it that the face of poverty, that the experience of poverty is concentrated in one demographic group, and being able to have or lead a life with certain amenities is more correlated to being of one group rather than another, of a different group? So especially in terms of where people live, in terms of how it is that they're living, those have high correlations with race as well. Spatially, when we go and we look around at the monuments, we see at who is commemorated. Here we have a statue in the middle, in the center. Here, the center picture is a statue of Queen Victoria that sits outside of the Pietermaritzburg legislature. It's a very strange thing, given what we know of the history of the town and what the actual role of the British was in KwaZulu-Natal and Pietermaritzburg more specifically. The issue here isn't that we should not recognize our history, but in the spaces being occupied by such statues without comment, without any interrogation or thinking about how this marks this space, is something that can also be construed as having negative effects. On the far right is from the census, from the 2011 census, showing how segregated some of our largest cities in the country are. And of the 6 largest cities in South Africa, Nelson Mandela Bay is the most segregated. The least segregated is Johannesburg, but it's still segregated. It's still like 0.57, which is almost like a 60% rate of segregation. So whatever the case may be, when we look at this, it's not good. It's obviously not good. So we've looked at some of the more material, general, structural ways in which the gains of racism are maintained, but also on there's personal costs here and personal gains for some in relation to racial prejudice and racism, continued prejudice and discrimination. For example, a preference for white hires, or keeping organizations white, or limiting the number of people from other backgrounds or social groups or races. Just exclusionary practices in general do confer personal benefits to white people. And then obviously the opposites of a benefit then is incurred by black people who experience this prejudice and discrimination. That there's costs to the racism. And then things that people call sometimes not really microaggressions, but racial aggression in general, which would probably also include whatever microaggressions are. The racist attitudes and racial aggression that people experience serves a social function, and that social function is usually to remind particular groups of their place so they don't step out of line, making sure that people remember where it is that they're supposed to fit in the social hierarchy. And so that's the function of insults, of beatings, of lynchings, of public humiliation. All of those things serve the function of keeping a particular type of social order and reminding people of what the social contract is or should be for people that are raced in a certain way. Then we also have the problems of strategic subordination, where people will actively work to make sure that certain groups remain subordinated, or exploiting particular systems that might um, give benefits for, say, hiring someone who's black, or hiring someone of a group of from a previously disadvantaged group or a currently disadvantaged group, where there might be some kind of government incentive or institutional incentive for inclusion. And the perverse way in which this can manifest itself is in tokenism, or in the private sector. There's tokenism too, but also in terms of fronting, and so on, with some of the personal problems that come with racism, that actually maintain the gains of racism for those who are able to actually be tokens, because even though there might be a black token, there's some personal gain that they would incur from taking on that role, but also for everyone benefiting from that structural system where it favors it's been favoring whites over the rest of the population. So the token themselves might gain something, and the people for whom they're standing as a token for, but society in general does not benefit from tokenism and fronting and strategic subordinations and all of those kinds of different strategic ways for people to gain something personally from racism. So let's return to the original question, which I opened up with when speaking about the educational drives against racism and against specifically scientific racism. Is racism really a scientific problem? Well, there are senses in which one could formulate a scientific problem about race, but in our social life, the function of racism and the function of theories and understandings of race don't really rest on truth at all. If the point of racism is to be a correct theory of difference, then it fails. It fails flat as a scientific theory anyway. It's incorrect. The opinions people have about what makes a race are false, whether they're thinking of groups essentially in terms of cultural essentialism, linguistic essentialism, or even biological essentialism about groups. All of those assumptions about groups are incorrect. And if those are the notions that are used to create race concepts, then obviously it's false. But as a way to order society, even if those theories are false, even if the general understanding of race is false, the public understanding, and even if all scientists agree that, all those ideas of race actually speak of things that don't exist and are false, it can still be an instrument used to order society, as has been the case. And as a way to order society, it's effective even if it's based on myths. It has been highly effective even if it's based on myths. And the one effective way in which it's been used is oppression. And the history of oppression shows this as race and racial classification as like a tool, a technology that can be used to order society in a certain way. So one of the points that I'm making here is that racism is setting up your odds. As a citizen of South Africa, or someone who comes to South Africa to live in South Africa, someone who has a history in South Africa, what you'll find is that racism, the problem of racism, is one that either incurs benefits or losses to you, depending on the group which you come from. That some things will become easier, some things will become a little bit more difficult, or a lot more difficult, depending on the group which you're from. Because of the history of race in this country and the operation of racism as a way to order society. So if the point of racism is to affect some ordering of society, the question becomes, what incentives are at play to maintain or perpetuate such an order? Who are the winners and who are the losers? Is it always that clear that there are a clear set of winners or a clear set of losers, or are there some things that are won and some things that are lost? And on the balance of things, who can be called a winner within those constraints or a loser in those constraints? And is it something we'd like to fix? Or is it something that we can fix? And in what ways would we fix this? Of course, I'm on the side of us wanting to fix this because I believe it's a genuine and deep problem. So racial belonging in a racist society sets one's odds, among other factors, of success, of life chances, of health, opportunity, life expectancy, general quality of life, and so on. I'm just going to give a few examples of this. So in terms of getting a job at your skill level, something does come to the fore when we look at labor force recruitment. On your left-hand side there, on the bottom left, is a pie chart. A pie chart showing the labor recruitment patterns of 2015 to 2016, of the 2015-2016 financial year, actually. And we see that more than any other group, and in fact, half of the people recruited into the labor force in the financial year of 2015-2016 were white individuals. 42% were white men, and then 10% of that was a white woman. So over half, because it's 42.1% of white men, and then 10% white women. So more than half of the people recruited into the labor force in this year, in the year of 2015-16, that particular financial year, were white. If these are the patterns of recruitment, then other statistics start making better sense. Statistics about earnings that we saw earlier, but more directly, statistics about unemployment in the country. So on the right-hand side is from a recent report from Statistics South Africa. This news site used the data from Statistics South Africa to draw this bar graph showing the unemployment rate by population group that we had in the fourth quarter of the year 2020. You see that the unemployment rate differs quite significantly for people depending on the population group they belong to. It's only 8.8% for white people as compared to 36.5% for black people. And just behind them are colored people at 25.7%. It's quite a big gap between 36.5% and 25.7% when considering that gap of unemployment is larger than unemployment in a lot of the world. A lot of places in the world don't even have unemployment of 10%, but that's the gap between the most unemployed group in the country to the second least employed group in the country. But then the distance between those two groups and, say, or the white population group is even more monumental. Yeah, but the difference between the white population group and the Indian and or Asian population group is only 3%. Difference in unemployment between whites and Asians is only about 3%. It's 3% exactly on this representation of the data. But the difference between, say, white and black is almost 30%. So another aspect in which we see how racism is setting up people's odds and really showing how people live a completely different life from one another, are stats about public safety, death and suffering and crime is concentrated in certain areas, in certain districts and certain neighborhoods, even within the same districts, depending on where certain population groups live. One will face higher crime. But this also then correlates with the policing. Let's say the function of the police is to stop crime and help keep people safe. The police per 100,000 people compared to murders per 100,000 people, you see that in places where it's majority white, you find far more police per 100,000 people and far lower murders per 100,000 people. Now, these are just correlations. There might not be a causal link between them, but there are underlying things that may support how these two correlative states of affairs relate to one another. And this is something that you see quite plainly here. Mitchell's Plain, for example, almost has the same number of police per 100,000 people as murders per 100,000 people. But once you look at places like Delft and Philippi, you find that there are twice the number of murders per 100,000 people than there are police per 100,000 people. And one just has to wonder why. Beneath that graph is a snippet I took from a paper that speaks about the participation of the different population groups in our formal healthcare system, in our formal healthcare system. Let me just read the results from this paper. It says a total of 40.8% of blacks and 22.9% of coloreds reported going without medical care at some point in the last year, compared to 10.9% of whites and 6.9% of Asians. Disparities are found not only in health, but in education, income, basic health infrastructures. So socio-demographic characteristics and perceptions regarding democracy, markets, and civil society were similar for blacks and coloreds and for whites and Asians. The conclusion that they come to in this paper is that 14 years after the end of apartheid, because this particular paper was published then, blacks and coloreds in South Africa are still underserved and disadvantaged compared with their white and Asian counterparts, especially regarding healthcare. I make a similar point using statistics on the right hand side there, where we show injuries per person and look at the different at the different communities and see what the rate of injury is for these different communities. And the patterns are similar to those that we find in the disparities in health and the disparities we find in policing and in the murder rates. Okay. So with policing, it's something that's a deep problem in the Western Cape, for example, but it's not just in the Western Cape. Also in Gauteng, you look at the policing ratios and the number of police as compared to the population. The number of police in this graph is depicted in pink compared to the size of the population, which is in green. And you see that there's a very, very, very big difference in the types of ratios that we have depending on the neighborhood which people are in. And when you think about it, there's another level here of, if you're thinking about policing in terms of of public safety. The presence of police means different things in different communities. Policing, let me actually just go with this rather. If you think about the private security sector as well, for those who have high police numbers in their communities already, they also have the additional security of these private security firms that they have. Say in a place like Camps Bay, where their policing ratio is much better than all the other places that are listed on this graph. But at the same time, they also have private security companies for the community, for the houses there, that each individual household probably also has an armed response that they're paying for. So the inequality isn't even actually fully expressed when just looking at these ratios, the police to population ratio, if you're thinking about it in terms of public safety. So not just in terms of concentrated disadvantage. It's not just concentrated disadvantage that we see with racism, but most importantly, there's concentrated advantage. Here we see some of that advantage, and I'm not going into the reasons for why this is the case, but just going into looking at the different life situations people find themselves in, given the population groups that they're in, that the chances of someone in a particular population group having a certain type of life experience. This is what the statistics are telling us. On the left here, these are the statistics about children living with their biological fathers. About just over 30% of Black children live with their biological fathers. There's a lot of historical and structural context to why that number is so low. Not to mention the migrant labor system in South Africa that began in earnest, really, that really messed up the family structure during apartheid. About 50% of colored children, and with Indian and white children, the percentages are about 80% or more. With the proportion of matric graduates who attain a bachelor's degree, this is what we are looking at in the center, top center graphic there. Over time, this is a scary graph. Over time, the Black, African, and colored population, their percentage of matric graduates who are attaining bachelor degrees is actually decreasing. It's at near the same level with about 5%, whereas in 75, it was higher than it is today, right now. So we have to ask ourselves, what has happened? It was increasing for at least the Black African population group until the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, before the trend really shows a decline. When looking at the bottom there, the graphic is a little bit too small, but that graphic shows household income, or individual income actually, and where the different population groups are distributed in terms of income. If one knows the geography of Cape Town very well, the urban geography of Cape Town, and looks at the picture there from census data of where different people live, one can see that white people in this graphic live in places that are far more expensive, closer to all the amenities, closer to town, than the other groups, than the colored, Indian and black groups. The further you go from the city center, the further you go from the coast, and with amenities, is the more then that you find other population groups. The closer you go to amenities and town, the more concentrations you get of white people, with the exception, of course, of areas of the CBD that have faced urban decline and are not the greatest parts of town to be in. So all of this is not accidental. Each of these examples implicate a lot of our social history, a lot of how space is designed in the country, a lot of our affordances to be able to participate socially. There's so much of life that correlates to racial belonging in this country. It's important to realize that that was the point of colonization and white supremacy more generally, and the point of apartheid. So class or economic status is essentially important to life chances, but given colonialism and apartheid in this country, there's going to be a significant correlation between racial belonging and those other factors on the demographic level of South Africa. And how these things perpetuate themselves are structural. It's not always something that requires racial animus. It doesn't always require people to have racist attitudes for the racial social order to continue. There no longer needs to be explicit racists around for racially unequitable outcomes. The original acts of prejudice and discrimination, the historical acts of prejudice and discrimination, have ingrained already in the way things operate, systemic and structural marginalization of specific groups. So racist attitudes at this point can make a bad situation worse. For example, like in discriminatory hiring practices, not hiring someone because of their race. But even those are usually a reflection of policing of already existing power relations. There's some wisdom in Steve Biko when thinking about the question of race in South Africa and how we've got to where we are. In his text, Black Consciousness in the Quest for True Humanity, he says, "There's no doubt that the color question in South African politics was originally introduced for economic motives, so that whites could enjoy privilege at the expense of blacks and still feel free to give a moral explanation for the obvious exploitation of black people. After generations of exploitation, white people have come to believe in the inferiority of black people, so much so that while originally the race problem was an offshoot of economic greed exhibited by white people, it has now become a serious problem on its own." This is Steve Biko's understanding of how the problem of racism has become a problem of its own. And that would be the types of things that we usually deal with more academically, like the educational drives that UNESCO was a part of. That is to undermine the intellectual foundations of racism, at least, or hypotheses about racism, at least. But now there's that problem, but also we still remain with this problem of economic exploitation and social inequality, inequity, and oppression. So how does one live well in this strange place? This is a question that's asked often in this country, asked sometimes in my discipline, philosophy. And in truth, I don't believe we can live well in this strange place without fixing our fundamental primary antagonism of inequality. So you can't live well. It's not possible to live well in this strange place because our lives are afforded by the oppression of others. The better we are doing, the more it is that we depend on the labor of people who are actually not benefiting from the society that we live in and the way in which the society is structured. So we can't live well in a strange place, but we can often live without a knowledge of the fact that we are not living well. We're not living right. We're not living in accordance to justice because of spatial design, for one. Spatial design of our communities and our neighborhoods are such that people are able to inhabit different worlds. And in these different worlds, they may interact with people from other worlds that are not so privileged and comfortable as their own, but their interactions will be transactional. So what this means is that when you have, if we call you a have, or the haves, they enjoy the benefits of society. We get to enjoy the swimming pools, the wine farms, and so on. But the have-nots move from their world into this world of the haves to serve. They come there to work in the gardens, to work the kitchens, to serve the food, to cook the food in the restaurants, to basically service and run the world of the privileged. But after they've finished serving in the world of the privileged, they have to return to their corners of disadvantage, their corners where they don't have such amenities, they don't have such spatial advantages, even if we're going to something as basic as how much space does your family have to share? How many rooms are in a house for a family of 5? All those kinds of things that are on the surface of it, and actually even further, much deeper, are absurd. These things are absurd in how they work. Why are the benefits of society distributed in the way that they are? Is this fair? Is this just? And the answer is no from me, of course. And then it actually just leaves us with the challenge. The challenge then is, what do we do about fixing this problem? So we know that the colonial and apartheid spatial legacies have a deep role that they play in the managing of these interactions between these demographic groups that we've been speaking about. So a question that I'm going to leave you with is, how is it that present South Africa is shaped by the past? There are 2 questions really that I want to drive home for you. The first is, how do you think dispossession, such as the 1913 Land Act, the Group Areas Act of 1950, the apartheid migrant labor system, the current urban economic exclusion that people face, how do all of those affect the economic opportunities and participation that people can hope to engage in by race? And specifically for the things that you're going to be doing in this course, are these problems exacerbated spatially? How is it, or in what ways are we organizing space to reinforce or to challenge racism and discrimination? These are the provocations and challenges I leave you with. And yeah, that was my piece for the Designing for Social Justice course. Thank you.